You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
This week on From Embers, we're happy to have Aric McBay on the show. He is an organic farmer, activist, and author who lives just east of Kingston. And we're speaking to him about his latest book. It's just out a month ago through Seven Stories Press, called Full Spectrum Resistance. If you'd like to get a copy or see some excerpts from the book, you can go to fullspectrumresistance.org.
So I wanted to explore the question of how we can build effective resistance movements. And I start from the idea, or I guess the recognition, that a lot of the critical social and environmental and political struggles of our day are actually losing, compared with other points in history where it seemed like progressives were really gaining ground. Right now, we're losing key fights, especially around the environment. We're in a critical window for addressing climate change and the climate emergency, and that's not happening effectively, and it's not going to happen through conventional government or corporate channels. But really, in many different ways, we're in a very challenging period with the rise of authoritarianism and the rise of right-wing governments around the world, and on different scales. We're really seeing a backlash to a lot of the social and environmental justice progress that has happened over the last 100 years, frankly. And I think one of the reasons we're experiencing that tide of losses is because many people have forgotten about how we won those rights in the first place. Many people have forgotten about the kind of mechanics and the tactics of social movements and of resistance movements in particular. And I'm interested in resistance as opposed to just dissidence, right? So dissidence is, I believe something different. It's really about belief. And the idea of resistance is a step further. It says, well, I believe these things, and I'm actually willing to go out and take some risks and disrupt business as usual and disrupt the status quo in order to establish a future that is just and that is fair and that is happening on a livable planet, right? Because our ecology globally is our limiting factor. So even if we, in my lifetime, have made significant gains in things like rights for gay and lesbian people and gay marriage in Canada, these other things, all of the progress that we have made really depends on us having a livable planet in the future. Because as the ecological limitations from heavy weather to food shortages get worse, we'll see more of these attempts to attack human rights and to attack participation in government in any kind of thinly democratic way. And so it's really incumbent on us to learn from the movements of the past, to understand what made them win, so that we can embody those lessons in our current struggles, instead of just getting stuck and frustrated with the fact that government is not going to fix things that, frankly, they didn't fix in the first place.
And this book, it just came out less than a month ago. This is the first time I saw it. How long did you spend writing this book, and how difficult was it to do, given the kind of changing political context that we find ourselves in right now?
So I started working on this book close to 7 years ago. And it's something that I had been doing some of the kind of general research before that. But about 7 years ago, it became a key project of mine because of various emergencies that were happening. And I think it was a challenging book in terms of the the political transitions that have happened in that time, right? When I was starting, things like Occupy Wall Street were really kind of at the fore in North America, or the Arab Spring. And most of those were short-lived for a variety of reasons. So I have been working to, it's a contradiction, I guess, that we always kind of have in projects where we want to learn lessons from history, is how do we make this evergreen on one hand and try to distill some things that we can always apply, and how do we respond to our current emergencies, which are certainly always changing.
And probably some of our listeners have heard your name before in terms of the Deep Green Resistance book and organization. Mm-hmm. And a lot has changed since then, since you were involved. Do you want to just kind of summarize what has shifted for you since you wrote that book with Derek Jensen and Lee Eric Keith?
Sure. So when I wrote that book, I didn't anticipate that there would be any kind of organization coming out of it. I thought, oh, well, this is kind of a way to help sharpen analysis and provoke thought. And when some enthusiastic organizers said, hey, let's form an organization, I was originally kind of excited about that. And then not long into the lifetime of that organization, Lee Eric Keith and Derek Jensen really started pushing some anti-trans policies in the organization, anti-trans people, really. And so I have always been firmly opposed to transphobia. I think it's very harmful for our movements and our organizations, and it doesn't respect basic human dignity and basic human rights. And so I ended up leaving that organization along with, I think, frankly, most of the experienced organizers who were involved, partly because of my moral rejection of those attitudes of transphobia, and partly because, in a practical sense, many of the best organizers I've worked with over the years have been trans people. And you can't have an effective organization or an effective movement without welcoming trans people and other members of the LGBTQ plus community. So I think that's an important lesson to learn from, that I hope other kind of radical environmentalists will learn from that, and the importance of really putting that at the fore. And I think in terms of the kind of broader political changes in that time period, when we started that project, the term climate emergency is not something that was really used. So I think I'm very happy that, from my own perspective, that pushing forward that idea of climate change being both an emergency and a limiting kind of factor for the success of other movements was really important. And I think now there's a much broader understanding. I think a lot of regular people now understand, hey, we actually, even, the UN says, oh, we have basically 10 years now at this point to stop catastrophic climate change. And even organizations like the World Bank, which are very conservative, recognize, oh, this is going to create hundreds of millions of refugees in the coming decades. So I think there is the wider understanding of that is very promising, but I also think there is still missing from environmental movements broadly in North America, especially white middle-class environmental movements, an understanding of the more confrontational direct action tactics that will have to be part of any movement that's going to succeed in stopping climate change.
So, the last book was called Deep Green Resistance. This book is called Full Spectrum Resistance. I assume that's not an accident. And yeah, I'm wondering about that maybe you just explain that shift in terms of the climate issue being a part of every other issue today, but also who's the audience, who's the intended audience of the book? I've noticed it sort of oscillates in its discussion of issues and tendencies within both liberal circles and radical circles. So who do you imagine this book is being written for?
Well, I have in mind that it is both for people who are maybe a little bit newer to organizing and activism, people who see what's going on in the world and think, oh, well, we have to really step something up. What do we need to know in order to do that effectively? And also to people who are more experienced organizers, which often means people who are more radical and often more militant as well. And so I really wanted to, rather than trying to address those groups separately, address them together, because I think our big challenge in building a movement right now is building a movement that is large and militant. And so those in power function very effectively by using divide and conquer, and always have. And those in power are capable of handling a small group of militant people, and they're capable of handling a large group of people who are more polite, who are following the process that you're supposed to follow when you want political change, like talking to your elected representatives and joining a political party. But they're not capable of stopping a group of people that is large and militant, a group of people that is large and disruptive. And often that's what we've seen in history has brought about different major successes, whether that's, the civil rights struggle or the, women winning the vote or the right to vote. And so that's what we really need to see, I think, is that kind of combination of mass action and militant action. I use the term full spectrum resistance because I think movements to succeed now, and this has also been the case in the past, but is more urgent in some ways, movements to succeed have to use a diversity of tactics. So that means both like community organizing and outreach, and a lot of these kind of gentler tactics that help build community, as well as disruption and confrontation. So we really have to see that diversity of tactics in place. And we have to see movements that integrate many different causes, and that understand many different causes. So right now, if we want to look at feminism or women's rights, like things like equalizing the pay gap, for example, which has been basically at the same level since the 1970s, that's not a problem that we can solve in the long term without solving climate change, because the disasters that climate change has already begun to cause will only exacerbate inequalities in our society. And likewise, I don't think you can have an environmental struggle which isn't based on an intersectional approach if you want that struggle to be effective. I think in North America, we've seen that it has often been the environmental movements run by people of color, environmental justice movements, that have won some of the biggest wins in the last 30 years. And they've done that often by combining community organizing with direct action. And as well, I think Indigenous solidarity is absolutely crucial to stopping climate change. In Canada, almost every new oil pipeline, every new tar sands project is being built on Indigenous land or through Indigenous territory. And so our success or our survival as a human species in the next 100 years really depends on the success of Indigenous struggles for autonomy, not just to stop those projects, but more generally to resist the Canadian project of colonialism and to resist genocide.
So I'm wondering how you would frame the kind of the politics of the spectrum that you're speaking to. So in terms of like, what are we resisting? What is the bad thing, and what is the good thing that the people across the spectrum kind of agree on? Like, what are the kind of basic political agreements that you would hope your audience kind of can agree to?
Well, number one, I hope we can agree that colonialism is bad, because that's kind of, I mean, in Canada and in many countries around the world, that's why those countries exist, right? I mean, Canada exists because of stolen land, and essentially the entire country is made up of stolen land. So if we talk about, oh, well, let's get the government to do this, or let's get the government to change this policy, then that's a colonial government. That's a government of occupation in some way, which is one of the reasons I think it's important to talk about movements as resistance movements, and to look at that history of resistance to governments of occupation, which is still in living memory for many different people. So I think that that's really important to understand, that we have to resist colonialism and fight for the autonomy of and self-determination of Indigenous people. I think that likewise, capitalism is another system of power that we should recognize as a universal evil and oppose, because capitalism at its core is a system where the rich people set the rules. And that's never going to produce a just future, and it's not going to produce a livable future in which we can survive. Feminism and anti-racism also, I think, are really core. And I think, really a broader sense of intersectionality, that I think this is where anarchism as a philosophy has so much power to help us kind of shape our strategies, because anarchism is an idea that understands that systems of coercive power in general are wrong, and that people should have a right to self-determination and self-expression that doesn't harm or oppress other people, right? And so I think that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of how we approach things. And I think also the things that I have kind of mentioned here, and obviously there's a much longer list than that, we could talk all day, but I think these systems of power and systems of oppression are important to understand because of the way that they express on kind of the macro and the micro scale, right? So obviously in the big picture, if we want to have a planet that's nice and worth living on, then we need to dismantle colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, etc. But also the way that they express themselves in our movements and in our groups on the micro scale, I think really determines how effective we are. I think what happened with Deep Green Resistance is a great example of how a movement that can't, or an organization that can't fully reject transphobia is a movement that's not going to accomplish anything. And that's the same applies to so many movements in history. I mean, and it's often very, very contradictory and fairly heartbreaking to look at the way a movement like even the Black Panthers was so, especially early on, was so hamstrung by patriarchy that, it was very harmful to many of the women who participated. And also to look at the suffragists in England, for example, who, while they were feminists, were also very nationalist and kind of pro-British. And so these sorts of things in the long term will always stymie our movements if we're unable to confront them. I think oftentimes we recognize in kind of a general way, gender is a construct, race is a construct. But we don't always talk in terms of why these things were constructed, right? I think the liberal perspective on racism and sexism is that it's a big misunderstanding. But these systems of oppression really were created to deliberately increase the amount of inequality in society so that people could be exploited. And so if we want to be able to create movements that can achieve things in a lasting way, that can achieve a more just world and a more livable world, then we really need to break them down at the macro scale and the micro scale. And I think in our daily lives, that starts at the micro scale.
One idea that you raise early on in the book in terms of the importance of fighting to win is this problem that you identify as the culture of defeat that exists in some circles. Just wondering if you could identify what that is and sort of explain that idea.
Sure. So I think speaking for myself, I grew up in the 80s and 90s in a time when I was not very well connected to a lot of social struggles. Looking back at kind of the historical scope of in North America in particular, that people often look at the 60s and 70s as this period where, oh, look at all of the things that they achieved for radicalism and for many different struggles. And I think life as a radical, life as a resistor is easier when you have wins that you can point to, just partly because it helps to motivate us and inspire us, but it also helps to show us what we're doing right and what we can improve, right? Because if we set out to do something and we achieve it or we achieve part of it, then that gives us some very clear next steps potentially. But I think when we haven't had that experience in a long time, when we haven't had that kind of strong culture of resistance, a living tradition of resistance that we've been a part of, then we can get into something that I call a culture of defeat. And that's potentially a self-perpetuating culture that happens, I think, in a lot of different radical circles and a lot of different radical communities, where people are less likely to participate in things because they feel like there's no point. There's more cynicism. People feel more lonely and withdrawn. And we also see, I think, more horizontal hostility. So that's the idea of, well, if you can't kind of punch up, if you can't attack those in power, then you attack people who are closest to you because they're kind of convenient, right? So it's easy for people to lash out, paradoxically, at the people who maybe have the most in common with them politically, instead of focusing on people in power. I think personal purity is often a part of that as well. There's this idea in social movements called the iron law of involution, that if a movement wins quickly, then it turns into an institution. And if a movement wins slowly or doesn't win, then it turns in on itself. And you have people who leave the movement out of frustration. And then on the inside of that movement, the goal no longer becomes material progress. It doesn't become to change some practical system of power. It actually becomes more about, I guess, policing other people in that movement to see who's going to be the most pure or the most radical or the most righteous or the most perfect. And that kind of becomes the activity that becomes the reason for existing. Which is a very dangerous thing because it's hard to kind of pull out of that nosedive. But I think we can avoid the trap of a culture of defeat by cultivating a culture of resistance, and that really means not refusing to be lonely and isolated and reaching out to other people even when we don't already totally agree with them, and having discussions that are sometimes kind of awkward or uncomfortable. I think it means crucially identifying tangible short-term wins that we can actually achieve, even that if that's on kind of a modest or reasonable scale. And I think that helps us to build momentum. I think that makes people want to be part of our movements. And I think it also lets us practice the capacities that movements need in order to succeed. It lets us practice to get better. So, and I also think celebrating wins by other people is really important, and looking at the wins that are going on in our community or in the rest of the world, even if those are imperfect. And it's really easy to say, well, all of these, this win did that wrong, and that win did this wrong. And it's easy to get into a position where we don't expose ourselves to any vulnerability because we don't, take any risks. But I think that in general, that's what those in power want, right? They want us to feel isolated. They want us to feel like there's no point in trying. And so in a culture of resistance, it's, I think, more about building that recognizing resistance and understanding that tradition of resistance, and also building a culture that's more supportive. And that helps people want to stay in that movement or in that group over the long term.
in that chapter about fighting to win, it raises a bigger question for me in terms of what is winning. So what are the things that we consider a win? Is it always just whether a group or a movement achieved its own stated goals, or is there sometimes things are sold to us as victories that don't always feel to us like victories? So I think we do need to have our own ways of defining victories and wins. So what is your kind of main way of defining that?
Well, certainly if a movement or a group sets out to do something and achieves its stated goal, then we can chalk that up as a win. But it also depends on where you're starting from, right? I mean, we are in a time in North America where, or certainly in Canada and the US, when a lot of movements are not especially strong. I wouldn't say we're in a period where radical movements on the left are kind of at their apex. So right now, in the short term, I mean, if you can get a bunch of people to come out to a protest, I mean, that could be a win in a certain time scale. Or if you can get a bunch of people to work together who maybe don't think of themselves as natural allies, I think that can be a win. And I think this is kind of one of the big challenges, and this is maybe always going to be the case for radicals, is to identify the intermediate wins between whatever is where you are and where you ultimately want to go, or the direction that you want to move in. There's not usually an easy answer to that question. As we take action, those answers become more obvious. So when you're looking at things kind of in an abstract, theoretical way, or in a classroom maybe, then I think it's a lot more challenging to say, oh, here's like a logical group of stepping stones to whatever it is that we want to achieve. But I feel like when we actually are out there doing events in our communities or trying to build coalitions or whatever it is that it's going to take in the struggle that we're focusing on, or the campaign that we're focusing on at any given moment, I think it does become more obvious what our next steps are and what feels like success. I was part of a group that was organizing against a pipeline in Ontario a few years ago. And after the first year or so of the campaign, we actually sat down and made a list of all of the different events that we had organized or participated in, and ranked them based on how effective we felt they were and how much we would want to do something like that again. And, there was one case where we had been part of a group that had taken over a pipeline pumping station that was under maintenance, and shut that down for about a week. And everyone ranked that as something that they would love to do again and that they felt was very effective. But there were also events that we'd done that were maybe kind of awareness raising that we ranked as effective but didn't want to repeat. So I think that, either of those rankings, anything that you've done that you're like, that I'm so glad we did that really achieved, something important, or something that you've done that's like, wow, that was worthwhile, that like makes it worth being alive, makes it feel like being a radical is worthwhile, then that's great. And I think really both of those things as categories can allow us to chalk something up as a win potentially. And that obviously changes, right? Like with the example of educational events, like if for the first time our group got together and brought a bunch of people out for an educational event and a chat, that was a win. But if we'd done that again and again, well, we wouldn't have rated it as highly, and it wouldn't have been as rewarding, and it wouldn't have achieved very much. So I think what is a win really does depend on the context and the trajectory of your campaign.
Yeah, and I think you also make the important point in your book that our defeats are also very important moments for us, at least as instructional or as, trying to fail better next time or something like that. So I appreciated that you also made that point about defeat.
Yes, I think we can learn a huge amount from defeat. One of the movements I mentioned in passing is the Dutch anti-cruise missile movement, which happened I think was most active in the late 80s and early 90s. And And that movement did not succeed. They didn't win their goal of banning cruise missiles from being stationed there. And some social movement researchers looked at the people who'd participated in that kind of failed movement and divided them up into 3 groups based on what they had done after this kind of movement failure. And the one group was what they called persisters, and they were people who kept going out to all of the same events, all of the anti-cruise missile stuff, and doing it more and more, even though, the participation was dropping, attendance at these events were dropping, even though essentially the movement had failed at that point. And another group were terminators, and they were people who were in general the least experienced with social movements. Maybe like the anti-cruise missile movement had been one of their first big experiences, and they just left. They terminated their participation in the movement and in social movements in general. And then there was a third group which of transitioners, people who were ready to move to a different social movement or a different campaign after that happened and kind of take the lessons from that. And those were mostly the people who were the most experienced in social movements, even more than the other 2 groups, even more than the people who kept kind of persisting. And I think that is really interesting because one of the reasons I wrote the book is because most of our campaigns arguably have not succeeded. Certainly that's been my experience. And so one of the most important skills that we can learn is how to keep going after that, how to learn from it and continue, and not A, just quit because everything's too hard, or B, keep doing the same things that don't work over and over, because both of those are traps. As that example shows, it's the people often who are most experienced who recognize, hey, it's time to shift our tactics and let's learn and move forward.
So you think I'm alone, but being alone's the only way to be. When you step outside, you spin like fighting for your sanity. This is a cold war, you better know what you're fighting for. This is a cold war, do you know what you're fighting for? If you wanna be free, below the ground's the only place to be.
Is there a particular scale that you had in mind? I know that you sort of define groups versus organizations versus movements, but is there a certain scale of action? I know you mentioned in the beginning, like one of the biggest challenges of our time is how do we combine large movements with militancy? So is that kind of what you're hoping can kind of emerge from this ecosystem that you're sort of speaking to? Is this ability for large movements, large militant movements with a diversity of tactics to be able to function as a kind of whole?
Yeah, I am interested in larger movements, but I'm also interested in particular in campaigns and that scale, because we can divide movements into, and I do this in the book, into 3 kind of general categories. There are social movements in general. That's kind of the biggest category of movements that are trying to make some kind of political or social or economic change in society. And within that are resistance movements that are trying to use, direct action or disruption to achieve that. And still inside of that shell is the group of revolutionary movements that are really trying to fundamentally transform the social and economic and political systems that they're operating in. And the reality is that, unfortunately, most of us don't have very many opportunities in our lives to participate in enormous revolutionary movements, right? Often where we start is more in the social movement end of the scale, where the organizing is on a smaller scale or a lower intensity. That's kind of the starting point that I'm interested in, because of the fact that it's a common experience and it's where we have to grow from. In terms of duration, I'm interested in campaigns rather than single actions or, 30-year transformations. And I think the reason for that is because within a campaign, ideally you have a set period of time that you want to achieve something, and you have a specific goal or goals that you can either reach or not. And you have a series of actions that you can undertake during that finite period of time. And then you also have specific kind of capacities that you need to build to make those actions successful, whether that's recruitment capacity, organizational capacity, fundraising and logistics, how to gather intelligence, these sorts of things. And I think that the time scale of a campaign really allows us to have some planning, and have planning with our comrades and friends, but also to learn and improve and get better and build all of those capacities. And that's really what the book is. The bulk of the book is about. I mean, the first 3 chapters are about more movement dynamics, or kind of the ecology of movements, and how radicals and militants and moderates and these different groups interact. But the back 9 chapters are about these different capacities that movements have to develop, regardless of whether they are, an insurgency on a national scale or something like the Montgomery bus boycott, right? Like, whether you are in either of those cases, you need things like logistical and fundraising capacities, right? And an insurgency needs people to bring food and supplies on the front lines. And the Montgomery bus boycott needed people to get their shoes replaced because they wore out their shoes from walking so many miles because they couldn't take the bus, or organize their carpools. And I think when you focus on those capacities in the context of a campaign, that's actually what allows you to scale up your movement from individual kind of scattered groups. And I think in general that is kind of what our limiting factor is as scattered groups, is that we aren't good enough at recruitment, or we aren't good enough at fundraising and logistics, or these other key things. And I think once you get to that a certain level of proficiency, your movement can kind of naturally scale up to a larger size wherever you're starting at. So in writing this book, I start from the perspective that most of the people who are reading it are going to be operating on the scale of smaller groups, face-to-face groups, in different campaigns, but that they're interested in expanding that, and they're interested in linking up with other groups in bigger campaigns and growing from there. Because, if we talk about these really big mass movements that happen only every 10 or 20 years in some cases, then that just limits our opportunity to grow and learn.
We'd be waiting around for a long time.
It would be a long wait, and we don't have a long time to solve things like the climate emergency.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up. That it's true. The bulk of the book is very practical, using a lot of case studies and understanding the ways these different groups and movements operated and built the infrastructures necessary to do what they're trying to do. It's also a big thing to undertake because, like you said, some of these groups are armed revolutionary groups. Mm-hmm. Some of them are, single issue campaigns. And I think, I agree with you that there are lessons that can be drawn and applied, sort of cross-applied across these contexts. Mm-hmm. But then there's also the question of prefiguration, I guess is what I'd call it, in terms of the ways that we organize ourselves now have consequences or in terms of the social outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And yeah, I think it's always tricky when we're studying, like, say with the American Revolution is one of the things that gets discussed in there. I think that we could learn a ton from the American Revolution, but also it was a settler expansionist project, right? So it's also sort of like an enemy case study, or maybe not enemy, but it's something quite different from what we're talking about. So how do you go about doing that in terms of trying to pick out things that are useful without recreating the same problems that we can identify in those other groups?
It's true. It is a challenge for, I mean, not just me in writing the book, but for everyone, because if we think that we can only learn from movements that have succeeded and that we totally agree with, then we have a sample size of 0, right? Or we would already be kind of living in the utopian future that we could prefigure. So it is a challenge, and I think in some cases we can learn a lot from movements that we actually disagree with. And I think that is still a worthwhile activity. For me, what I try to do is in particular understand how a movement or a campaign changed over time. That's one of the key things that help us to, I think, learn lessons, because we're never starting from the ideal point, right? We're always kind of trying to evolve our movements to be more inclusive or more confrontational or whatever it is that is kind of lacking at any given moment. And I think often that's not under our direct control, right? There are so many factors that kind of influence how a movement grows and develops and how it responds. And often the bigger it gets and the more impactful it gets, the less under control it becomes, right? Because if we're working in a face-to-face group of people we handpick and trust, well, that's one thing. But if a movement really picks up speed, then it typically is, it has a life of its own, right? And so that's another reason why it's important to understand these movements that are not perfect, because if we succeed in movement building, and if we succeed in really getting people to rally around any particular cause, then we're probably going to end up with a movement that's not perfect, that's complicated, and that's a big part of understanding how we can still move forward and still achieve worthwhile things in that context. Because any movement that we look at in history has people who are maybe in a position like us, right? I mean, in the American Revolution, it's not something that I talk about in length in the book, but there were people who were kind of part of a barons' revolt, who were part of the upper classes all along, and wanted less taxation from the British so they could make more money. And then there were people who were really down at the bottom, who wanted something totally different, who wanted a different transformation, and were put in very tough spots in terms of the decisions that they had to make. And so I think it's worthwhile studying imperfect movements, not just so that we can learn kind of broadly transferable lessons about tactics and strategies, but to get us thinking in a practical way about how we participate in imperfect movements today.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to kind of the theory of change that's at play throughout the book. And I think one of the main points that you're discussing is this dynamic between moderates and militants, I think is how you frame it. And you bring up concepts like the Overton window, radical flanking, and this kind of ratcheting effect between radicals and moderates. Can you kind of explain that idea?
Sure. So I use kind of this spectrum of moderates at one end and militants at the other end. And so to be very general, moderates are people who really want to have a conversation. They want to make people understand the need for social change or for a more just society, and kind of really educate them and hopefully involve them in that process. Militants are people who don't necessarily prioritize that. They want to confront and stop injustice wherever they can. They want to get in the way. They want to fight. And I think in our often in our movements, militants and moderates get kind of lumped in as liberals and radicals. That sometimes we say, oh, if you want to fight, then you're a radical, and if you don't, then you're a liberal. And I actually think that's a separate axis. I think, radicals are people who want fundamental transformation and collective action. And liberals are people who kind of want to tinker around superficially and believe generally in more individual solutions. And that's, there are militant radicals and there are moderate radicals. But those are not, the same thing. It's not the same to be a militant and a radical. So I think that's partly important to recognize going in. I think in general, one of the things that our movements are missing is more militancy, right? And I think that a lot of large movements right now and kind of established progressive organizations don't understand the importance or the necessity of militancy. They don't understand the ways in which it won us many of the rights and victories that people take for granted now. And so because of that lack, because they feel so uncomfortable with militancy, they often spend more time trying to suppress it than, the government does. It's a very unfortunate circumstance. But there are lots of ways in which militant action helps people who are moderate and helps people who are liberal as well, frankly. Militant action through things like the Overton window, as well as kind of radical perspectives, those help to normalize the kind of world that we want to create, the kind of world that we want to live in, right? The Overton window is actually an idea from the right wing that, if you say a bunch of stuff that's kind of out there on the edge of what's considered acceptable, then you have ideas that were once unthinkable that kind of become generally more normal. And the right wing is great at this, right? I mean, look at Trump. He'll say anything and kind of drag the rest of society off toward this right wing. But also people like Rush Limbaugh. I mean, there are lots of folks on the right side who have done this. But I think on the left in general, people are much more afraid of militancy and they're afraid of radicalism, even though it's a big part of what helps shift the dialogue in our broader culture. And that was the case with so many struggles. If we look at the civil rights movement, people, even on the right wing now, love to look back at Martin Luther King and say, oh, what a guy. But even people in the left, in Martin Luther King's own church organization, the Southern Baptist Convention, thought he was this dangerous radical. Everyone wanted him to stop doing these, breaking the law, and speaking out in favor of immediate integration. But for him and other people in the civil rights movement really pushing what they wanted, that the civil rights movement would not have advanced without that, right? I mean, it had been 100 years since the Civil War, and clearly just saying, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we were slightly more fair to people of color was not going to do the job. At the same time, I think for radicals, it's really easy for us to discount the importance of kind of the moderate radicals, right? Of people who want to have a conversation, who want to do community organizing and make people understand, because that's also one of the major ways that our movements grow, right? Is that we invite new people to join our movements and explain to them why it's important. We can't build a successful movement just through militant action and just through direct action. That helps put a lot of pressure on governments and other people potentially. But if we're not engaged in that other kind of activity, then it's very difficult for us to grow to the point where we can actually pose a real threat to the status quo. And that's difficult balance to find sometimes, but I think it's also an important one. I think the danger, from my perspective, is not from radical moderates, but from liberals, and that's because people who are radical, whether they're militant or regardless of how militant they are, they want to create pressure, right? They want to create pressure for change. They want to heighten the contradiction. They want to disrupt the status quo and make people uncomfortable, because usually change doesn't happen if people are not made uncomfortable. And liberals don't like that. They don't like conflict. They want to alleviate that pressure, right? And radical moderates can do that, can help to alleviate the pressure by leading a conversation that actually addresses historical injustice. But liberals usually kind of want to restore things the way they are, and that usually means some kind of fast compromise that potentially undermines whatever movement they're working with, if that's a more radical movement.
Yeah, I think that what you just said helped clarify for me my own thought process when engaging with this, because I think I was doing a bit of confusing this dynamic, as you call it, between militants and moderates as a dynamic between radicals and liberals, in part because, in thinking through my own experiences, how in my own short life, how many times I've felt that liberals have used radicals as mercenaries and then kind of sold them out and institutionalized certain things that end up being used against us. Mm-hmm. I know that's really abstract, but just it does feel like a dynamic to me. But I think when you frame it that way in terms of radical moderates and radical militants, I can see that a lot more. Whereas I feel like in this, especially in Canada, where liberalism is a hegemonic idea that's often used to actually govern this country, I do kind of orient towards liberalism as a kind of authoritarian threat, if that makes sense, and not just like a right-wing kind of threat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think for most people who are kind of on the left or in progressive communities, liberalism is the big stumbling block for us, right? I mean, on a political context, if we're looking at who's forming government, then sure, we can talk about conservative parties and right-wingers. But in terms of our kind of day-to-day dynamics when we're trying to make tactical decisions at a march or at a protest, it's that liberal approach that is the problem, because it's an approach that is... part of the problem is that many people who are part of that liberal group really do benefit from the status quo, right? That they have a lot of privilege because of the way that our society is structured. And there is a reason that the opposition in Parliament is called Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, right? That's like liberalism in a nutshell, that you that you can disagree with those in power, but you're still loyal to that basic system. And in Canada, that system has been really broken for a long time. I mean, it really is. It is a colonial state, right? And so I think it's important for us to be disloyal and to encourage people who are attracted to that liberalism to think more deeply, or to organize in a way that's going to kind of minimize the potential for liberalism to undermine genuine progress, I guess.
Wondering what your take is on, let's call it like the newest, hippest form of radical action, which is, seemingly very diffuse, very internet-based, very viral, and really lacks like a social organization. At least that's how it seems from the outside. And, how do the lessons that you're drawing in your book apply to people who are growing up around, say, like the Ferguson Uprising or Occupy or the Gilets jaunes or something like that as their reference points?
So one of the things that I think has been a common factor among historical resistance movements that have succeeded is there's always kind of a face-to-face core, that underlying relationship has always been there, that community relationship of people who know each other and trust each other. And that's important for a lot of different reasons. And I don't want to discount the value of online organizing. I mean, clearly it has a lot of potential benefits, especially around our ability to mobilize people quickly, to respond to changing events, or, to bring a lot of people out to events or actions. But I think that that face-to-face, those face-to-face relationships and community relationships have been so crucial for a bunch of reasons. One of which is they help us to get through hard or divisive times, right? Because if you have a face-to-face relationship with someone and they've been your friend for years, if you have a political disagreement that's maybe not kind of catastrophic, that's a small disagreement, if you can usually get over that, right? If you have that kind of foundation of friendship, if you have that foundation of community. But if you don't have those strong ties with them, then it's maybe easier just to never talk to them again, to get kind of more fragmented. So that's a big risk if we're kind of lacking that face-to-face foundation. And I think in general, it's also important for when a movement wants to escalate, because there is this idea in social movement research of strong ties versus weak ties. And weak ties are like, oh, you know someone, they're kind of like an acquaintance, maybe you're in the same Facebook group. And strong ties are someone, oh, I know this, I've known this person for years, I trust them. We grew up in the same place, or we participated in this action group together for a long time. And it's difficult to undertake something like civil disobedience, for example, if all you have is weak ties. If you're going into a situation where people are, trying to blockade a pipeline, or trying to, shut down an event at a police station, these kinds of risky situations, most people will not go into if they don't have a group of people that they trust, that they have this kind of affinity with. So I think it's important that even though we can use kind of social media-based organizing very effectively, that we also use it to try to funnel it back into that movement building of face-to-face connections. And of course, we haven't really been talking about the difference between above ground organizing and underground organizing, or kind of public organizing and more secretive organizing. But a lot of resistance movements, in particular of the past, but even in the current day, have relied on underground organizing to be successful, right? Movements, if you're organizing a movement in Nazi-occupied Europe, then you were not going to be able to do that openly in any way. It had to be an underground movement. A lot of queer movements in many parts of the world have, and in some cases continue to be underground movements for practical safety reasons. There were underground movements in the U.S. around abortion up until Roe v. Wade, and now some people are talking about having to kind of revive those. And in the context of a time when governments it seems like governments are becoming more authoritarian in some places. That's a trend. I think it's important for us to recognize that mode of organizing that has been around in a lot of history. And you can't organize an underground group on Facebook. Facebook is a surveillance system primarily, right? Obviously, it's still very useful for a lot of kinds of organizing. But the purpose is that Facebook can monitor all communications and understand how to better market products to people, and how to sell their personal information to advertisers, or to, Cambridge Analytica, or to right-wing people, or to the police. So that's another real limiting factor, I think, in terms of organizing that's primarily online, is that it kind of traps people in the above ground in a way that is maybe not intentional for those people to do. That if we have relationships that are not based on Facebook or not based on kind of social media, then those are also more private relationships, and that can potentially give people more avenues for action in the future, depending on what they think they might want to do and what they anticipate the political situation might be.
Yeah, that makes me think about in Deep Green Resistance, there was a pretty clear strategy that was sort of proposed. That was decisive ecological warfare was the kind of like strategic proposal in that book. This book doesn't have a single strategic proposal as far as I could parse out of it. What's the reason for that?
I think the reason is that Deep Green Resistance for me was emerging out of a specific context in which more people needed to recognize the climate emergency and understand the scale and the militancy of action that would be required to confront that. And even as I say this, that sounds kind of abstract, right? And so looking at a particular kind of strategy, even as a starting point, even as a thought experiment, let's compare this to other things that we might do, I think allowed it just to be more tangible for people in a way that it's very, because it's so easy to be lost in abstractions. I think the point of full spectrum resistance is different, and I want it to have a broader application. So obviously things like the climate emergency is still very real and very urgent. But there are, Deep Green Resistance was always going to be targeted at a narrower audience. Whereas I think something like this, the lessons that we can learn from a variety of movements apply to many different kinds of movements. They can apply to non-confrontational community organizing. They can apply to infrastructure blockades against the petro-state. They can apply on all kinds of scales and in all kinds of causes. And so because of that, I wanted to leave it more open-ended because really what I'm interested in doing is giving people a collection of tools that will help them be more effective in the kind of work that they want to do, right? It's like giving someone a toolbox. So there are certainly some situations where you want to have like a very specific tool, but I think in general it's good to have options and to understand the options that are available. I think for both people who are in from a more moderate perspective or a more moderate starting point, I want them to understand the militancy that's available and frankly, the militancy that has helped us win so many of our victories in the past. And vice versa. I want militants to be able to get better at recruiting new people and enlarging the size of our movements and and using that as a mechanism to magnify the impact of militancy and of confrontation. This full spectrum resistance emerged in a different way. It started for me partly because I was just making my own checklists of things that I wanted to be able to do at action, so we wouldn't have to always start from scratch every time, kind of brainstorming, how are we going to gather intelligence about this site that we want to do in action? What do we need to bring for this thing? How are we going to recruit people? I wanted to kind of streamline that process so we could start off further forward every time. And that's why many of the tools in here are broadly applicable to different movements, and I think people who are at different stages of their activists' careers or their organizing careers can kind of use them and learn from them. And not everything in there is going to be applicable to every person, but I think nonetheless that most people who are organizing will find hopefully a bunch of things that are useful and a bunch of things that are kind of interesting case studies that help inform their perspective or their strategy or their approach, and also a bunch of things that maybe help them understand other groups better or the way that other groups that they're working with are organizing.
And the book does look at a lot of historical case studies, but I'm wondering what kinds of things happening now in this broad part of the world is inspiring you right now? What's giving you hope?
Well, I'm really inspired by Indigenous resistance very broadly, I think. Indigenous resistance against pipelines like Unistoten is extremely exciting to see the success that they have had and continue to have. I mean, they've essentially caused the cancellation of at least one pipeline and may be able to cause the cancellation of another. So that's really exciting because of the way that kind of movement and that kind of campaign intersects with so many other things as well, right? Like the way that it's confronting colonialism and also kind of the oil economy and confronting patriarchy, really, because I mean, in Canada, with the history of missing and murdered Indigenous women, we can't separate patriarchy and colonialism. So I see those flashpoints as really important to building movements that are diverse in terms of their tactics and their approaches in the rest of Canada and in the rest of the world, because I think it shows people, oh, hey, this actually works, and inspires them to go out and do solidarity actions or other things like that. I think I'm, in general, also excited by this. There's, currently kind of been a wave of youth-oriented climate action, which I think has been a lot more intersectional than some of the environmental movements of the past, which I think is very promising. And I think this is a movement that understands the urgency of the situation and is actively trying to learn and grow and find new tactics and new approaches. And you can see that in the vocabulary. People are talking about things like the climate strike, which I think we also have to be careful not to overuse or water down certain kinds of vocabulary, right? I mean, a strike historically has been something that pretty directly interfered with the means of production or shut down a workplace. So I think we should also be careful to try to, if we're going to use that kind of militant language, to also think, oh, how can we use this action as an opportunity to actively disrupt something bad that's happening? One thing that I do want to mention is that the framing in the book is really about looking at different case studies and different examples. And that's kind of the main lens that I use. So we have been talking, because of kind of time constraints and the nature of podcasting and other things, in a more general way and in a more abstract way. But I think in the book, I really do like to zero in on particular historical events or and what we can learn from them. So it's not like a philosophy of resistance book primarily. It's more of a practical emphasis. And I think that in the bigger picture is also where we kind of win people over. Because if I talk to people about something like capitalism, even among other people who are maybe generally on the left or generally progressive, that kind of term for a lot of people is still kind of abstract, and they might not be hearing the same thing that I'm saying, right? Whereas I think the more specific and tangible we can be in our language and our struggles, the more successful we're going to be, right? People really respond to a threat when it's imminent, both in the sense of being close in physically close to us and also close in time. So we should always be looking for those opportunities to really be specific, and that if we're talking about the climate emergency, to talk about whatever extreme weather has been happening in our area and how that's affecting us, and also the practical next steps that we should be taking to address that. Because I think that is one of the major strengths of movements that have won in the past. And it's easy to just look at their kind of list of achievements through a historical lens and say, oh, well, they won these for this and this reason and da-da-da. But all of those movements are also based on thousands or tens of thousands of conversations with specific people about the issues that affect them on a daily basis. And I see no reason for that to be different in our situation in the modern day. So the more we can drill into those specifics and the more we can identify tangible forms of action for people, I think the more success we'll have.
You've been listening to From Embers here on CFRC 101.9 FM, a weekly show of anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. That interview was with Aric McBay, a local author, activist, and organic farmer. He just released the book Full Spectrum Resistance, which can be found in your local library or bookstore, or you can find excerpts and information online at fullspectrumresistance.org. As always, we'd love to hear feedback from you. You can reach us by email at fromembers@riseup.net. And if you'd like to subscribe to our podcast, just search for From Embers through whatever app you use. Have a great night.
In the province of Ontario, we have a premier who says, I don't do protests. I don't do anything that these special interest groups say that I should do. I don't give a shit if you put 250,000 people on the front lawn of the legislature. It means shit. Because the people who live and the people who die in the street are considered to be a special interest group. Now, when we're told that, and the question's been raised about mass movement and the mass mobilization of people. If you can mobilize every person in the province of Ontario, it doesn't mean that there isn't going to be 75 people die in the streets of Toronto this winter. It doesn't mean that. So when we're confronted by a government that chooses not to respond in any way to public pressure that's through the normal course of the process, then as an advocate and as a participant in that process, you have to examine how far am I willing to go?
The border is not just a wall. It's not just a line on a map. It's a power structure, a system of control. The border does not divide one world from another. There is only one world, and the border is tearing it apart.
The Ex-Worker Podcast presents No Wall They Can Build, a guide to borders and migration across North America. A serialized audiobook in 11 chapters released every Wednesday. Tune in at crimethink.com/podcast.